Paul Brunton's Spiritual Journey, Part 2, My First Initiation into the Overself, continued. It is at times necessary to give a man a shock to show him what he is really like. This is usually done by friends, sometimes by enemies, and occasionally by the master. It is always done by life itself. The experience is painful, but if its lessons are sufficiently taken to heart, the debt owed to it is a large one. By making necessary changes, he is saved from avoidable sufferings in the future. One day I was faced with an unexpected event which gave me a tremendous shock. The emergency called for all the wisdom and strength and determination I could muster in order to deal with it. I succeeded and shook myself out of the spiritual depression and took up again the practice of meditation as well as occasional attempts at self-improvement. This transition period was succeeded by another when I acted more resolutely and worked more diligently to meditate daily and improve myself than I had done in years. There suddenly came a feeling of impending momentous discovery. 6 weeks later, I found myself plunged for 2 hours one evening, which was twice as long as the period allotted each day to the practice, in the deepest mental withdrawnness for me at the time. During that memorable session, I recovered once more the degree of consciousness which I had enjoyed in the earlier period of my quest, although there was more knowledge and understanding this time. I could see more clearly that there was a definite preordained pattern in my life and in the lives of others. All the chief events had some kind of inner meaning in them. All could teach some lesson, which, if learned, would lead to spiritual growth. To discern these lessons, we have to develop a more mature emotional attitude in our relations with others, and also a stronger character. We have to get out of ourselves and look at each situation, momentarily at least, the way the other person involved in it looks at it. Then we have to seek true justice for all and not be selfish. In the course of that evening's inner work, I found that my thoughts were being definitely directed by some impulsion, which was not altogether my own. It led me to retrace briefly the past history of my spiritual career, and especially to examine carefully the point where I missed my step and lost my path. I analyzed the reasons for this mishap until they were perfectly clear and taken deeply to heart. Then I was led to build up imaginatively a picture of what might have happened had I successfully passed the tests. I was also led to see that each man or woman who had been brought by life into short or long association with me had borne a silent message or embodied a hidden test, or else was someone to be helped or served in a way which would reveal itself in time. That presence, my soul, which was and yet was not myself, told me inwardly that during all my confusion and frustration which had filled the second cycle of my spiritual career, it had never left me and remained beside me, waiting until the time my own efforts would unite with its magnetic power to liberate me. I was told there was in this a great lesson, the necessity of hope, which I ought to communicate to the aspirants I would meet later, who were spending fruitless, barren years of spiritual seeking, and who were becoming discouraged by the lack of results. Inexperienced travelers on this path often find that their early enthusiasm wanes, and they become discouraged by harsh testing and rebel against the quest. So I had to instill the lesson of never abandoning the belief that the struggle was worthwhile, of always trusting the eventuality of grace, and of living in the memory of their past uplifted moments. Those who are intimidated by the quest's difficulties ought to be stimulated by its rewards. They should take to heart the truth that no spiritual darkness is a permanent one, and that at no time are they really lost, deserted, or fallen creatures. If their will weakens or their light clouds, it is an inevitable part or result of their imperfect nature, as well as of their unfinished development. But it is also a condition which must right itself with further experience, evolutionary pressure, or unexpected grace. When my meditation seemed to have ended, a great store of strength poured into me. Indeed, it was so overwhelming as to appear irresistible. I felt that every obstacle could be overcome by its support and help, and that I merely had to stretch out my hand to gain victory. Suddenly I saw a vision in which a duplicate of myself was pushing a huge boulder away from the entrance to a cave. I knew instinctively that the boulder was a symbol for the lower self, and that the cave was a symbol for the higher self. I could feel a change working rapidly in my character and personality, bringing me closer to the ideal which I held. I succeeded at last in rolling away the boulder and, with that, attained a certain degree of self-mastery, which from that moment onward remained with me. I felt that I could never again fall below that degree, that it was no more possible to do so than it was for the hatched chicken to return to the egg. I stood at the entrance to the cave and looked inside. I found it to be full of light, dazzlingly brilliant by comparison with the murky gloom outside it. The power to enter the cave was not given to me, only to stand at the entrance and gaze inside. I understood that the inner work necessary to gain this power would constitute the next cycle of my labors. The vision came to an end, and with it I realized that a man does not become truly humble until he has first seen himself as truly great. The glimpse of his higher self throws a powerful light by reaction upon his darker one. He discovers how simple, how ignorant, how weak, and how arrogant he is and has been. If the discovery brings him to the ground, it also stimulates him to resolve to remake himself in the image of the ideal. With the shaming contrast between the animal and the angelic in him, as well as between the human and the divine, he is penetrated through and through with the need of imposing the higher will forcefully upon the lower one. The years that succeeded this vision were years of development and growth. One of the most interesting new phenomena of that period came about occasionally when I was entering into or emerging from the deeper states of meditation. Out of the silent recesses of my being there came forth utterance, yet no form was to be seen and no one was there, nor did any vision come with it. This was the mystery, that speech came into existence without a speaker. It was the activity of vocal intuition, a presence which spoke to the inner ear and not to the outer. It must not be confused with the hearing of audible voices such as mediums and psychics are supposed to hear. It was nothing of that kind. This was one's spiritual self speaking to one's human self. I suppose it was what the German mystics of the 16th century called the interior word, and what the medieval saints of the Catholic Church meant when they claimed that God talked to them. It was definite, commanding, forceful, insistent, and authoritative. If it gave an order, it gave also the power needed to carry out the order. Yet it was not the intuition associated with everyday existence as an occasional phenomenon, for that is usually a mental first impression or a silent feeling. That intuition may well be the faint beginnings of this voice, which I like to call the voice of the Overself, or soul. I had complete confidence in its guidance and realized that wisdom comes from inside. No need to go anywhere or to anyone else. The place where I heard this voice became ever after a holy sanctuary, an oasis of peace, and a citadel of strength to which I could return or retreat whenever I was alone, or whenever a crisis of the outer world was impending. People think too often that they have to travel to distant places for wisdom or teaching. They fail to recognize that it is not only within themselves, this wisdom or this teaching, but that it will never be found anywhere else. The echo of some other person's wisdom will never take its place. To find the holy presence by withdrawing from the world temporarily into meditation was much easier than to find it while busy in the world. That was a different task. To go on from there until it became a fixed phenomenon was still harder. It may help others to learn how I did this. I had entered into a session which combined prayer with meditation. Although I assumed the usual physical position, and it was the customary hour for the evening practice of meditation, actually I gave myself up to my feelings and spoke silently from the heart in fervent prayer. I addressed my words to the Overself and related how I had come evening after evening to this inner tryst, and I emphasized that it was aspiration and the attraction of love which had drawn me away from every other activity to spend more than an hour in this one. I admitted that an uplifting spiritual experience had often been the result, but I complained that the end of each session was the end of the experience. The next day had to be spent in ordinary consciousness, like the day of any other person uninterested in the quest. I had taken up the practice of exercises in constant recollection, as well as exercises in declarative muttering, but to no result. They were not my path. I still got so immersed in work or talk or whatever I happened to be doing that I forgot the practice and failed to carry it off. It became obvious that if I depended on myself, on my own poor and feeble power, the effort could not end in anything but failure. There was no hope for progress unless the Overself came to my rescue and, out of its grace, brought about the desired state. I asked ardently for its help. Indeed, I begged for it and lamented that life was worthless unless it could be lived continuously in that state. I carried on this one-way conversation in a lovingly familiar yet humbly beseeching tone. A response came at last. I felt myself being carried down deeper into my inner being until a level of rich consciousness was touched. It required great intensity of purpose, great resolution of will, and extreme power of concentration to remain on that level, so I summoned up these resources and succeeded in remaining. After a while, I was instructed by the inner voice to form a mental picture of a duplicate of myself at work, in talk or travel, or in any other activity likely to be entered during the following day. In this picture, I was to keep hold of the awareness in which I was now held, and not to let my attention wander from it for even a minute. I was particularly guided to include such occasions or contacts where I was likely to be provoked by annoyance, irritation, over-concentration on work, and excessive physical activity into forgetfulness. Thus, the first step was to make the desired state come true in imagination. This could not be done without the fullest trust that it would do so, and without the fullest consent of my logical mind that it could do so. The second step was to identify myself imaginatively with the ideal state during the day as often as I could remember to do it, and during formal meditation periods as intensely as I could force the mind into doing it. In the first step, I had to project a picture of myself as active in the outer world, to put forth a thought form which would incubate for a period of time like an egg. I had not merely to think about that desired state from present conditions, but also, indeed rather, to think from it. I had to determine my outlook by it, as if it were already an actuality, and to imitate all the characteristics and qualities it had. I was not to gaze up to the idea, but to gaze down from it. In the second step, the ideal had to be knitted into me, as if by a magic spell. I had to play the wizard and enchant myself into first seeing and then being what I aspired to become. At first, it was not possible to retain that peaceful state continuously. I would fade away intermittently. Both to prevent that from happening and to make the needed conditions to sustain its presence, the practice of this exercise in creative imagination became necessary. I found the exercise a valuable one for use in meditation practices of later years, and so pass it on for the benefit of others. Even then, I knew that the effort required was too great for me, that imaginative power alone was too insufficient for such a result to be achieved without grace. If I had to depend on myself, on my poor little human self, the end of it would be merely an illusion, which would one day be harshly dispelled, or a dream from which I would one day rudely awake. The imagination by itself was not capable of bringing such an exalted state into actual realization, but the imagination plus grace was capable. When the ego works on its own self, its willingness is reluctant and its power limited. When grace works inside the ego, its participation is joyous and its power unpredictable. Does divine grace exist? Orthodox theology makes an arbitrary fact of it and does not correctly present it. Yet it is reasonable in theory and verified by experience that it comes down to meet and mingle with human aspiration. But it is also a fact that such a desirable consciousness is not likely to happen if the aspirant fails to fulfill the conditions controlling its appearance. To be continued in Part 3. Quotes for this video were taken from The Notebooks of Paul Brunton, Volume 8, Reflections on My Life and Writings, Chapter 1, 2 essays. Please subscribe. Paul Brunton, 1898 to 1981, a best-selling British author of a dozen books, spent much of his early life researching the original sacred teachings of Western and Eastern spiritual traditions. He traveled the world to discover and communicate with Christian, Kabbalistic, Vedantic, Buddhist, Taoist, indigenous, and Sufi masters. Blending the richness of his own spiritual experience and inquiry with these ancient and contemporary teachings, he developed a philosophy and path of practice that suits life in the 21st century, one that expresses the greatest wisdom and love available to humankind. Regardless of how it is named, we each have a divine soul, an overself or higher self, that is with us here and now, waiting to be realized. Paul Brunton's writings are a source of deep spiritual guidance for all those interested in living a divinely inspired life.